So welcome everybody to the Civics Project. I'm Beth Rebay, the host of the Civics Project and the director of Repair, which sponsors the Civic Project each Sunday as a publicly accessible space for people to learn about government and politics. And before we begin today's episode, I'd like to start with a brief land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tobangar, the Los Angeles Basin, and the South Channel Islands. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarahaton, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanuk Fatam, ancestors, Hihiram, elders, and Iohinkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. So as many of you are aware, today's subject focuses on the term and concept of domestic terrorism. And I want to explain a little bit about what that means and what types of people and activities it generally describes. And then we'll focus a fair bit of today's discussion on white nationalism and domestic terrorism. Given that, as interestingly, the Department of Homeland Security has put it, white supremacist extremists are, quote, the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. So first, let's start by just breaking down the concept of a little bit. Most folks have a kind of popular understanding of what a terrorist is, mostly from movies and sometimes from news reporting. The basic conception of a terrorist is a person who uses violence or the threat of violence to achieve political ends. And that's such a broad definition, and it's always interesting to see what kinds of activities are or are not recognized as terrorism. The interesting thing about the term domestic terrorism is that it means terrorists who are using violence to achieve political ends and in some way challenging the state, but are also part of the United States, so also US citizens. So one of the things that we know is that most US anti-terrorism law presumes that a terrorist is somebody who is not a United States citizen and is attacking the United States from outside in some way. So even if they're on US soil, they're doing so as someone who's not recognized as American per se. So domestic terrorism has created challenges for policymakers and folks involved in law enforcement because it's in some ways very distinct from the ways in which anti-terrorism law usually works. And one of the things that means is that if you're engaging in domestic terror activities, a lot of the anti-terrorism laws that exist in the United States can't be applied to your activities. So domestic terrorists per se have much more protection in the US legal system than people who are not US citizens. And there are relatively few laws that actually can be used to address domestic terrorism. So I'm initially going to go over what some of those are. One is hate crimes laws, which can be used to combat activities that are essentially about using violence as a political threat or political weapon. One of the problems, though, with hate crimes laws is that, even when they're well written, they're not always really enforced or applied. So one of the things that we see is that local law enforcement, state law enforcement, and sometimes federal will classify terrorist acts, domestic terrorist acts, as some other kind of crime and not recognize them as an hate crime. So to give you a sort of concrete sense of that, an example would be if you took a cross burning on someone's lawn and just categorized that only as arson and didn't recognize it as a hate crime. So the only thing you recognized as a crime would be basically deliberately setting a fire in a way that was dangerous or unlawful. So we have hate crimes laws, but they're underused. A lot of times, actual hate crimes are not recognized as such. And some hate crimes laws are just not very strong. So they often don't have all that many penalties for a person who engages in a hate crime. And usually, like much of our criminal law, have no interventions or ways to ensure that a person who does such a thing is rehabilitated or doesn't engage in hate crimes in future. We also, of course, have individual criminal laws that address kidnapping and violent acts and murder and some of the different forms of activity that domestic terrorists might engage in. One challenge, though, of using those sorts of individual criminal penalties is they don't give the state any way to challenge the underlying organizations or networks unless they can establish that there's been a criminal conspiracy, which sometimes they can, but it's harder to do in our criminal justice system. So they're very individualized, and they focus on criminal penalties only for those individuals who engage in violent acts. A third area in which domestic terrorism is addressed is through entities like the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and Homeland Security. And they do have a lot of resources. But one of the things that we've heard from folks who've been in those institutions or who have been enacted with them is that while the FBI and Homeland Security are equipped, if they want to address domestic terrorism, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, that often, particularly where white nationalism is concerned, they've taken that same approach, only going after individuals who've committed violent crimes rather than going after the networks that have produced them. And I'm glad to talk more about what that means. We also have some efforts that haven't succeeded yet in US government to address domestic terrorism through legislation. And those efforts are ones which are particularly keeping the problem of white nationalism at the forefront. So in 2019, Congressman Dick Durbin introduced the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2019, and it never got all the way through the legislative process and has been introduced in 2021. So, in this moment, in August of 2021, as we talk about what exists in our legal system at the federal level, there's really no one piece of legislation that does all of the things that would need to be done to address and combat domestic terrorism. Instead, there's different pieces of law and policy and entities that partially address the issue. And the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act, if it were passed, would move towards really centralizing more of those activities and creating more burden on the federal government and on state governments to address domestic terrorism as an institution, including by rooting out white nationalists and Nazis who are within law enforcement systems, which I think is an important priority. So I next want to talk about what groups are recognized as domestic terrorists. Interestingly, for a while the United States government now recognizes white nationalists as by far the greatest threat in the United States, for a while the number one tracked and recognized groups receiving the label of domestic terrorist were animal liberation organizations. So people who, for instance, would break into animal research labs or other things to advance animal rights. Sometimes Black nationalist organizations have been defined as terrorists. Muslim and Palestinian organizations, which are not engaging in violent acts, unfortunately have been repeatedly classified as terrorist organizations in the United States, so basically misidentified as part of the kind of anti-Muslim climate that's existed in the United States, particularly since September 11th of 2001, although of course plenty of anti-Muslim racism did exist before then. And then last but not least, our state does recognize white nationalists as domestic terrorists. So it's a really interesting and sometimes troubling label, the idea of being a domestic terrorist. And there's still not a lot of clarity about who is it, when, what does the term mean, how is it different from a regular terrorist, and so forth. And we can also think about it from the perspective of what acts are understood as terrorism. So generally speaking, just harassing someone or engaging in discriminatory behavior is not sufficient to earn the label of terrorist. There needs to be physical violence or at least an explicit threat of political violence directed against the state or to achieve political ends. Often significant destruction of property like bombings, for instance, or setting fires will result in that designation, or I should say sometimes it will. Kidnappings, things like that, taking hostages. So these are examples of the kinds of acts that are understood as terrorists. Just want to acknowledge our Zoom audience is asking some questions. One is anti-domestic terrorism legislation a partisan issue, or is there agreement that something should be passed? No, it's highly partisan. There's not agreement between the Republican and Democratic parties about how it should be understood and what priority it should be. And someone's also asking, what about the designation of the Black Panthers or similar organizations as terrorists? And we'll talk a little bit more about basically race and the domestic terrorism label. But yes, as I noted earlier, Black nationalist organizations and Black militant organizations have often been very readily labeled as domestic terrorists, whether or not they were indicating or had engaged in any kind of violent act or threat. The next question that I want to just think about and pose, though, is how is the US government embedded in or involved in white nationalist networks? And this is an important question because with other kinds of domestic terrorism or groups that are labeled as domestic terrorists, this really doesn't come up, right? There's no allegation anywhere that members of government or law enforcement are secretly involved in animal liberation, right? Or that the US Congress is complicit in Muslim terrorism, right? So this only really becomes an issue when the question is the relationship of the state to white nationalism. And it is an issue because we see that there's in fact many ways in which the structure of the US government does contribute to or facilitate white nationalist recruitment or mobilization or lack of accountability for white nationalist behavior. So in other words, not all domestic terrorists are viewed similarly by state entities like the FBI and Homeland Security. So how is the US government actually involved in white nationalism? A major avenue of this is through the US military. One of the things that we know, and that's quite well documented at this point, is that the US military is a recruitment site for white nationalists. So white nationalists find each other and cultivate new members through military service, and also encourage people who become active white nationalists in communities to enter the military and get military training and then come back and use those combat skills in civilian settings to further white nationalist ends. So in and of itself, the fact that this happens wouldn't necessarily mean that the US government condones it. But one of the things that we see is that the US government has actually enabled tacitly white nationalist recruiting in the military by failing to enforce policies that indicate that you shouldn't be both, for instance, a Nazi and in the US military. Formally on the books, there is policy to that effect, meaning saying that like if you're a member of a Nazi organization or party, or you're engaged in Nazi activities, if you are a Nazi, you shouldn't also be in the military. But the various branches of the military have gotten around that rule by saying that you would need to demonstrate that a person is engaging in activities as a Nazi, not just identifying as one. And since a lot of Nazi and white nationalist activities, which would trigger these kinds of policy concerns, are also under the table, underground, it's not enough to, for instance, belong to the American Nazi Party or the National Socialist Movement and be in the US military generally to get you discharged. So you're allowed to be simultaneously a part of a white nationalist group that's identified as a terrorist organization and in the US military. And again, enforcement is just extremely weak. So the US government has sort of continued to allow white nationalists to use the military to get training and to use the military to recruit and mobilize members. And even where policies exist that should counter those practices, they're generally either being misinterpreted or under enforced. A second way in which the state is involved in white nationalist networking and movement building is through the criminal justice system. And this involves two branches. So the first is that white nationalist gangs are generally allowed to operate and recruit and engage in hate crimes, often without consequences in US prisons and jails and state and municipal prisons and jails. So the acknowledgement that white nationalists operate above the radar, are well known, are getting tattoos, are operating as gangs, are engaging in violent acts. None of this is news to folks involved in the carceral side, meaning incarcerating people of our law enforcement. But there's almost no policy or action taken to disrupt those networks or to counter white nationalist organizing within prisons and jails. The second way in which our criminal justice system is embedded in white nationalism is that there are active white nationalist networks within law enforcement. So operating in police departments and in sheriff's departments. And this is an issue that we've certainly seen engaged and challenged in the United States more frequently, as we've recognized that there were a number of, for instance, off-duty cops who in January participated in the Capitol riots, the attack on the US Capitol building by Trump supporters, many of whom were white nationalists and were wearing or carrying white nationalist paraphernalia, and the support for those attackers from within certain sectors of, for instance, the Capitol Police Department. So recognizing that law enforcement operates and enables white nationalism is, a significant policy concern and won't be remedied unless municipalities and states and the federal government develop explicit rules and protocols to basically say you can't be in law enforcement and also be a white nationalist. And so far, we don't see those kinds of protections in place. Though again, if the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act were to pass, it would start to make some strides. Like military service, white nationalist networks encourage their members in some instances to train as police officers, encourage them to enter the police academy, become police, both to get training that will be useful in violent combat and to increase protection and legitimacy for white nationalist organizations by having friends and a presence in the police force. A third way in which the United States government essentially does facilitate domestic terrorism in the form of white nationalism is through basically very differential practices in monitoring and investigation. So one of the things that, again, folks have reported from within those systems as they've left is that entities like the FBI are much more likely to organize and infiltrate and monitor home movements when they are racial justice movements. So for instance, Black Lives Matter, or historically, as someone mentioned, the Black Panthers, the state is much more likely to say, these people are a terrorist threat. We need to learn about their whole organization and figure out how to disrupt their structure. Whereas when it comes to white nationalist organizations, our law enforcement entities are much more likely to say, we will go after the individuals who are engaging in these violent activities, but not the whole organizations, because they have speech rights, they have assembly rights, they're real Americans, right? So one of the things that we see is that ideas about race and who's an American versus who's attacking the United States seem to have significant influence in federal and state law enforcement. A additional way in which the government is implicated in the presence and sustenance the ongoing power of white nationalism in the United States is through deliberately mobilizing white nationalists to participate in US elections. So one of the things that folks involved in electoral politics know really well is that at least a significant number of white nationalists will vote, and that if you use white nationalist rhetoric in a political campaign, they are very likely to vote for you as long as they identify with your racial identities, and as long as you are, tacitly or openly welcoming their support. So you're not openly condemning them, and you use their rhetoric, they will vote for you, even if it's otherwise against their own economic or political interests or beliefs. So our politicians know that using white nationalist rhetoric alienates some sectors of the voting population and mobilizes others. And on the political right, particularly for some sectors of the Republican Party, even politicians who will say, oh yes, I'm against hate crimes, I'm against white nationalism, are often intentional about cultivating white nationalist voters using racist rhetoric because they know that it can push them over the top when they otherwise don't have the votes among the public. And a last way in which the US government is sort of more broadly and structurally involved in facilitating white nationalism is simply in maintaining systems that create a lot of poverty and economic inequity. If you talk to people who are current or former white nationalists, one of the things that they'll tell you is they love to recruit when white people are struggling economically. So if you have a sort of frustrated, underemployed or overworked or economically vulnerable white working class, white nationalists absolutely love to go stir those folks up and turn what are essentially economic frustrations into racial scapegoating. And so we see that deliberately creating, structured inequality or passively maintaining structured inequality economically facilitates white nationalism. The more people are economically secure, the smaller the base of white people who will join white nationalist movements. I want to say a little bit to folks about white nationalism as a concept and its history, and think a little bit about why it's so implicated today in US policy about the use of terror per se. So white nationalism as such has a number of different dates in which we could say it originated. Some would say that white nationalism was the foundation of the colonizing of North America. And I see a lot of truth in that statement because it was certainly the idea that this would be a white European state, a white European place, was certainly intrinsic in the process of colonizing Turtle Island, what we now know as North America. The concept of whiteness, though, wasn't as significant. It was important, but it wasn't as significant in some of the earlier colonial periods as it was to be European per se. And so we also mark the birth of white nationalism in the mid-19th century as politicians started to become invested on figuring out how to keep white working class people from banding together with communities of color, with Black people, with Indigenous people, who had a common interest in rebelling against the government, which was run by white, very wealthy elite men. And so the idea of whiteness started to become more and more important to try to help or encourage white working class people to feel more identified with the people in power than people who share their economic vulnerability. So the idea that if you're white, you get rights, you get privileges, was used to get people to be white people, to be more loyal to the state. And we really saw that practice becoming more and more part of public rhetoric into the mid 19th century and right into the Civil War era. The birth of white nationalist organizations, as we think about them today, we can date to a specific period. December 24th, 1865, was the birth of the Ku Klux Klan in Pulaski, Tennessee. This was less than a year after the end of the Civil War, and all of the first Klansmen were Confederate Army veterans. And the story about it was that essentially 4 of them got together, got drunk. We're talking about creating, kind of a vigilante and unofficial policing organization to restore white supremacy in the aftermath of the Civil War. And, at least some of the historical record indicates that, some of the wild names that are associated with KKK titles like Grand Dragon or Imperial Wizard emerged because these 4 veterans were basically getting drunk and joking about it and didn't imagine how widespread or large this movement would become. So at the time, it was almost like, yeah, let's call ourselves this, right? As kind of part of that joke. But what we found is the KKK really caught fire, literally and figuratively, very quickly, because there was enormous resentment and misdirected guilt and rage and fear among white people about the destabilization of white supremacy. And so Klan chapters sprang up quickly in the 19th century and continued into our contemporary world. The 1930s in the United States started to fuse European white nationalist movements and US white nationalist movements, or bring them at least into more direct dialogue, particularly through the emergence of Nazism. So the first Nazis in the United States emerged with a party in the 1930s. If I recall correctly, the year was 1933, and it was known as Friends of New Germany, and was explicitly prompted by a German chancellor who asked German Americans to basically form this Nazi organization in the United States. It didn't last long, but was rapidly replaced by other Nazi organizations, which persisted above ground and continued to mobilize in the United States, basically until the bombing of Pearl Harbor, at which time, as you can imagine, during World War II, Nazism became a lot less popular than it had been, though it still had its strong sympathizers in the United States. Now, there are obvious differences between Nazis and Klansmen. Klansmen often are rooted in white Southern Christianity or some incarnation of white Christianity. Nazis tend not to be as likely to be affiliated with any religion and to see Nazism itself as the primary belief system. Nazism also has found and built over time a strong support base among youth in white power music movements, for instance, punk movements, and those are often somewhat dissonant or at odds with Klan type organizations, which tend to be sort of, again, more traditional white Southern Christians. So you won't always see that white nationalists all like each other. In fact, there's a lot of internal conflict, but there's still enough basically shared racism and shared beliefs about the meaning of race that these organizations have essentially synced with each other well. And then we saw a new era for the resurgence of white nationalism in the civil rights era. And I want you to notice that every time we see sort of an upsurge in white nationalism, almost always it tends to happen when racial justice efforts are starting to threaten or challenge or shift power relations in the United States. So this strong upsurgence of the KKK in the 19th century, right after the Civil War, then the resurgence of US Nazism and Klan activity as the civil rights movement started getting more attention. And then we see again a resurgence when Barack Obama is elected. So a common notion people have is that, once Trump got elected, white nationalists all just showed up and became white nationalists, and they hadn't been before, and suddenly they were mobilizing. And actually, while it's certainly true that there has been white nationalist growth in the past 4.5 years, what we saw is a marked uptick in white nationalist recruitment beginning in 2008, when it became clear that there was a serious Black candidate for the US presidency, and then particularly when Barack Obama won. It caused a lot of white people to feel enough resentment and anxiety that they explicitly embraced white nationalist organizations rather than just holding sympathetic racist beliefs. So what the Trump era did was basically embolden white nationalist organizations to go more public, right? So white nationalists who've been mostly operating below ground in the Obama era came to the surface and started marching around with tiki torches, declaring their presence, feeling that, hey, Donald Trump is our candidate. He used explicit white nationalist rhetoric and terms in his campaign. We know he's with us, and we're now here to declare that this is our America. So the next thing that I want to just identify are some of the major white nationalist networks. And we should note that there are quite literally hundreds of white nationalist organizations. In fact, I would say at this point, there are more than 1,000 if we think about all the different variants and offshoots of white nationalist organizations operating in the United States. Generally, the largest one is the NSM, or National Socialist Movement, which is an explicitly Nazi movement. And they have a larger membership base, for instance, than KKK chapters taken in total. But there's some, obviously, that we've heard of lately, like the Proud Boys. And then there's some that are, particularly about training violent militias. One of the better known ones of those, but I would say still not well known, is called Atom Waffen, spelled ATOM, like an atom, WAFFEN. So you can find militias and militant organizations that are training white nationalists for a supposed race war. And earlier, when I was talking about the response of federal law enforcement and the failure to recognize white nationalist networks rather than just going after individuals when they commit violent acts, this would be a great example. Atom Waffen has been mobilizing for years, and there's been very little relatively national security or federal law enforcement attention paid to combating or exposing them, even though they are successfully recruiting and infiltrating the US military. And even though their explicit goals, involve causing a great deal of violence and trying to facilitate violent attacks in the United States borders. There are also some organizations that I think skirt the borders of what law is going to recognize as a domestic terrorist. And folks also asked the question, and I think someone just did in the chat ask the question. Yeah, so someone asked, is the Tea Party a white nationalist movement? So the answer to that question depends on how you define white nationalism, but my answer would be yes, it is. So there are different ways to think about white nationalism. One is you're a white nationalist if you're somebody who wants a purely white ethno-state. So there's some white nationalist organizations that want to deport or kill anyone who isn't white, and by their own definitions, which also includes a lot of people who on the US Census would be considered white, like white Jews. So the belief in a white ethno-state is one way that you very clearly can be identified as a white nationalist. But some white nationalists aren't so much about saying no one can be in the United States and not be white, so much as saying this should be understood as a white government and citizenship should be attached to whiteness, and then other people can be here in subordinate positions, basically being economically exploited or second-class citizens. So that's another way that you can identify as a white nationalist. But not everybody who shows up at a Klan rally or gives themselves a swastika tattoo is even clear about their belief systems, and white nationalist organizations will still embrace them. And so sometimes what you find is someone is a white nationalist because they basically believe that white people are the real Americans, white people are persecuted, and anyone who's not white is a threat to white people, and they may not have a clear sense of what should the government look like, so much as a sense of white people need to get together and mobilize. The Tea Party never explicitly says in its sort of formal declarations that there are whites only organizations. So that's one reason why we would question that whether they're a white nationalist organization. But what we see when we look through their rhetoric is there's a strong presence of white nationalist iconography and messaging. For instance, you'll sometimes see nooses representing lynching or swastikas showing up at their rally. Strong overlap with other white nationalist movements. So plenty of Nazis and Klansmen are also active in the Tea Party. Almost no participation from anybody who doesn't identify and isn't recognized by others as white. And explicit rhetoric in which anything which involves people of color having equality or power, for instance, having a president who's not white, having rights for immigrants, is seen as anti-American. So if we understand white nationalism as the belief that that white people should be the dominant racial group in America, then the Tea Party could be classified as white nationalist. But if you require that it's to be a white nationalist, you had to say, I want a white ethno-state, no one else can be in it. Then what I would say is then the Tea Party would be sort of flirting around the edges of that, but our state entities probably would not recognize them as a terrorist organization. And there's still inconsistency in the US government about whether or not the Tea Party is recognized as domestic terrorist organization. And that's true also for a lot of the alt-right. So these are white nationalist organizations, at least a good number of which claim to be nonviolent or peaceful. Some of them kind of appropriate language of racial justice by calling themselves white civil rights organizations. And so they would definitely say we're not terrorists, we're law-abiding. Although we, also have plenty of evidence that these organizations organize events in which their members are engaging in violent, racially motivated attacks on people of color, sometimes on Jews. So the question of who's a terrorist is a really fraught one. And again, really differentiated because where our federal entities would be much faster to classify people and organizations as terrorist if they were associated with Black or Muslim or Palestinian communities, we don't see that same clarity coming around white nationalism. So as an example, for instance, here in Los Angeles, where I am recording, we once had the arrest of the Los Angeles 8, who were 5 Palestinian people who were arrested for supporting a so-called terrorist organization, which was basically just doing charitable relief. There was actually no credible evidence that they were engaging in a violent act. And they were arrested here in the United States for doing things like making a charitable donation to, an organization that was doing humanitarian work, like providing food to people who were in embattled territories because they were Palestinian. And their case was deliberately put before a Jewish judge who had a history of being a Nazi hunter, and who I think someone imagined would therefore be willing to, prosecute their case very energetically. They assumed that because he was a Jew, he would hate Palestinians and he would want to get them. And the judge in this case was Judge Einhorn, and he said, yes, I'm a very committed member of my Jewish community and have a history as a Nazi hunter and prosecutor, but there's no evidence here. These people haven't done anything wrong. So the sort of tactic failed, but the classification of people who are engaged in, some sort of unpopular racial justice work with the state as terrorists has been an ongoing issue. And certainly more recently, we've seen this with Donald Trump, trying to declare that if you are associated with the concept of Antifa, anti-fascist, sort of like identifying as a feminist, right? So it's a concept, not an organization, but he proclaimed that he wanted to sort of just declare anyone who is involved in Antifa, meaning anti-fascism, as a terrorist. And none of this, I think, is news to those of you who've been watching the news this year in 2021 and before, but it, sort of highlights the ambiguity within the state about how to recognize and what to describe as terrorism. So I want to close today's discussion with 2 things. One is just to talk about what would it take to combat white nationalist activities in the United States, whether we define it as domestic terrorism or not. And first, to highlight a current initiative that's coming directly from the Center for American Progress and the McCain Institute with support from Congressman Dick Durbin, who's also the author of the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. And they've crafted what they describe as a national policy blueprint to end white supremacist violence. So if you are listening to the podcast and want to look that up for yourself, you can Google or use your search engine to find National Policy Blueprint to End White Supremacist Violence. And it should pop right up. And I've also, for our Zoom audience, put it directly into the chat. And while I wouldn't say that this particular proposal covers absolutely everything that I think would be urgent to do in the long term, it advances a number of urgent initiatives, and I think is a good start relatively. So take a look at that if you would like. And I want to just go over 7 broad policy considerations that I think, and I'm just going to acknowledge them because having a deeper conversation for them would put us way over our time limit for this episode, but want to just identify sort of as a broad question, not just looking at individuals or organizations, but the conditions that create white nationalism. The first is to just address deep-seated racial inequity. And this involves dismantling and, first of all, acknowledging both the legacies and the ongoing manifestations of white supremacy. And a fundamental priority in doing so obviously means recognizing the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples and engaging in deeper work and conversation about reparation to Indigenous peoples. Similarly, recognizing and grappling with the history of racial slavery of African and Caribbean people, and engaging meaningfully with their descendants about reparation. And broadly, all of the ways in which racial inequity is structured into the United States have to be taken apart. If we understand white nationalism as an effort to maintain those institutions, when those institutions don't exist anymore, we won't have this problem. That's not to say that this is something that can be done thoroughly in a generation or with one policy, but this should be understood, of course, as the broader landscape for talking about combating white nationalism. And in some ways, this almost doesn't have to be said, but it still does have to be said, which is that you can't dismantle legacies and ongoing manifestations of white supremacy. You can't combat racism without doing anti-poverty work. So as long as we have just enormous suffering and economic inequity, we're going to see that it's going to keep creating racial inequity. So those two things have to be done as one work, essentially. A third broad policy aim that needs to start now, but needs to be an ongoing work, is a major state investment in access to healthcare and particularly mental health. One of the key things we know that effectively works for white nationalists and being able to recruit and build movement is to play into the trauma and sometimes the mental illnesses of people who are susceptible to white nationalist rhetoric. If we create mental health resources for people, while this won't fully eliminate the problem, it will do major damage to white nationalist recruitment efforts. White nationalists meet emotional needs for people who are not being taken care of by the state. And that allows them to recruit people who otherwise might not be receptive to their message. A fourth broad policy aim, we need to deal with white nationalist recruitment and mobilization through social media and need to figure out what that looks like at the policy level. How much of that should be done by the state? How much of that needs to be done by corporate media? What do we do to not just make social media a free organizing resource to allow white nationalists to find each other, not just around the United States, but around the world? And this question becomes complicated as a policy issue around First Amendment arguments. So I recommend to folks who are wanting to think harder about this, look up the words, the ACLU needs to rethink free speech. This is an op-ed that was authored several years ago after the Charlottesville attacks by Kay Sue Park in the New York Times, and it went viral. And in it, she really challenged us to think more deeply about the First Amendment and racial justice and about not allowing Nazis essentially free rein to silence or terrorize people in the supposed name of free speech. And this, op-ed was written after the American Civil Liberties Union had mobilized to defend in court to defend the rights of Nazis and white nationalists to march in Charlottesville, which resulted then in the death of one protester, Heather Heyer, and the injury of many others at the hands of violent white nationalists. A fifth broad policy aim is to thoroughly eliminate complicity with white nationalism, involvement in white nationalism in federal law enforcement and local and state law enforcement and the military. So I've raised this several times, but it needs to keep being said because it is an urgent priority. We should have explicit policy and monitoring and screening and reporting mechanisms so that you cannot both be in law enforcement and be a white nationalist. And some of those policies can raise some complexity in terms of rights of assembly and belief systems, but many can be implemented, readily within our existing systems and just are not. So we've got to get the people who are engaging in racist violence out of positions of legal and criminal and military authority. A sixth area is election reform, right? White nationalists will continue to find sympathizers and enablers within the US government as long as the mobilization of white nationalist voters can get some people into office. So creating more equity and access to elections is in and of itself one of the ways to root white nationalists out of the state. And the last thing that we need to deal with is the problem of mass incarceration, which is a much larger conversation that I can tackle in this particular episode. But stay tuned because the Civics Project will continue to engage with questions of incarceration, criminal justice systems, and really thinking through different approaches that exist to remedying some of the existing problems, whether coming from people who identify as prison reformers or prison abolitionists. So we'll have time to learn about some of those various positions in future. Last but not least, my reading recommendation for today is a report. Usually it's a book, but today it's a 60-page report issued by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And the title of it is Ku Klux Klan, A History of Racism and Violence. And I think that for folks who are wanting to begin to understand how white nationalism has emerged in the United States, this historical foundation is urgent. So again, the publisher is the Southern Poverty Law Center. And the title of the report is Ku Klux Klan, A History of Racism and Violence. Thanks so much, first of all, for everybody who tuned in for today. I want to invite everybody who is here in our Zoom audience or who listens to this podcast episode in the next few days to join us on Wednesday, August 25th of 2021. We'll be doing a special event titled In God's Name, a conversation about white nationalism and faith. And our goal here is particularly to talk about two things. One is attacks by white nationalists on faith communities, and we'll hear from some of those community leaders in response. But another is to talk about the ways in which right-wing Christianity and Christian nationalism are embedded in white nationalism in the United States. So I hope many of you will turn out for that. You'll find it on our Eventbrite registration page. For those of you in the chat, I'll add the link here. For those of you who are listening to the podcast episode, you can find our Eventbrite page for registering for future events in the notes that accompany the episode. So again, that's Wednesday, August 25th of 2021. And it's at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern time. And it features some special guests, Sophie Bjork Jameson, who is an anthropologist who studies right-wing Christianity and white nationalism. Aziza Hassan from New Ground Muslim Partnership for Change. Umar Hakim Day, who's a really amazing activist and thinker organizing in Compton, California. And last but not least, Deb Kent from Bend the Arc Progressive Jewish Action and from Jews Against White Nationalism. So I hope that you will come out to hear Sophie, Aziza, Umar, and Dev on Wednesday. And upcoming from the Civics Project, please come back next weekend. We have a really wonderful guest coming in to talk about Puerto Rico and its status as a US colony, and that's Nicole Hernandez from Puerto Ricans in Action. So she'll be with us on August 29th. And then we'll be back on September 5th, as promised, with more conversation about the criminal justice system, specifically focused on youth incarceration. And we have two special guests. One is Edgar Ibarra, who's a youth incarceration survivor and activist, and the other is Dominique Nong from the Children's Defense Fund. So hope to see many of you in the next couple weeks. And again, thanks so much for those who joined us live and those who are listening in. For our Zoom audience, feel free to hang out for a few minutes. I'm glad to take more questions and also unmute so that you can chat with each other if you would like to. And again, thanks so much, everybody.